My name is David Yun, and welcome to my Viewfinder. This is a podcast where I speak to photographers about why they shoot, as opposed to what they shoot with. My hope is to produce inspiring content to get you out there looking at the world creatively. Each episode will end in a thought or project to help bring this to the fore, so make sure you get to the end and interact with me. If you're interested in continuing this project with me, you can help me out by clicking subscribe and leaving me a review on your podcast platform of choice. You can also find me on Instagram at my Viewfinder Podcast. I'm on Twitter at MVF Podcast, or you can email me directly at mvfpodcast@gmail.com. Today's guest is Eric Donovan, professor of astrophysics at University of Calgary and photographer. In this, the first part of 2 episodes, we're going to start with the intersection between art and science and how creativity is actually required in both. There's an assumption that science and math are cold and calculating, robotic, but Eric believes the opposite is true. Not only that, but that living emotionally is the key to our success. Let's find out his thoughts here, and remember to stay to the end for some of my personal thoughts, reflections, and perhaps even a project. These are a little bit longer than usual, so let's just get right to it. What are the surprising things that you might have, surprising opinions you might have that might be unpopular even?
Well, I mean, it's going to be unpopular to say this because I am. You know, you probably classify me as a socialist. I'm a pacifist, a socialist, somebody who abhors violence, and I've been working very hard in my life to get my biases about race and gender issues to really get those so that they are a thing of the past for me, and really try to help the world be a place where people are free to be themselves and supported in that. I agree with a lot of what Donald Trump says. And that's the thing I think people would find surprising. I detest him. I utterly detest him. I think they should throw him out of office with the 25th Amendment. I think he's been an awful force. And I think part of the reason why he's done as well, if he had been just marginally more reasonable, I'm sure he would have won a second term. He was just so unrepentantly abhorrent, and the reason why he is so popular, is that a lot of what he says resonates with people. Globalization has hurt people who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And other people don't say that. And he says that. A lot of people who have trouble economically, it's actually not their fault. The message from the left and from the center and from people who want to believe in this meritocracy is that if you're not doing very well, it's your fault, right? But for a lot of people, it's not their fault. For a lot of people, it is circumstances that have been put upon them by outside forces. And a lot of those times it's globalization forces. And Donald Trump says that, and people love him for it. It tells them it's not my fault. Right. And so when he says that, I think, I hate the messenger, but if we don't acknowledge the negative impacts of globalization on people, I think we're in peril of Trump, right? And then the other thing is, I'll say something. My grandfather fought in World War I, and like all things, Trump takes these things too far, but my grandfather fought in World War I. I loved my grandfather very dearly. He was 17 years old when he signed up to go. I can't imagine my 16-year-old son fighting in the trenches in a year like that. That's like, I try to imagine that. I try not to imagine that and try to imagine it at the same time. And that war was pointless. It was pointless. And when Donald Trump said, why would I want to go and visit those graves of those dead US soldiers from World War I? Why would I want to visit a bunch of suckers? And people heard that. And what they hear is a terrible statement, a statement that's about as politically incorrect a statement as one can make, especially in the US. It's a statement that that is disrespectful of men like my grandfather. At the same time, for much of my life, I have thought, why in God's name did people sign up for a war that was just a bunch of elitist people who were fighting over some land, and 6 million people died for nothing, like nothing. There was a front. That front moved around a little bit, and that's it. Like there was no morals, there was no values, there was nothing better about the Allies than the German side. There was no reason for that war, and so in some sense, the people who went and laid down their lives for that, they laid down their lives for nothing, which kind of makes them suckers, right? So I find myself, when Donald Trump says these things, like if you strip away his crudeness and you strip away his awful misogynistic and narcissistic personality, there's a reason why these things actually resonate with a lot of people. And I find myself surprised by that. I'm surprised by when he says something and I think, yeah, maybe. So
yeah, I mean, I don't want this to be a political thing. It's interesting. I think I've been spending a lot of time trying to understand the same thing. And the only thing that I'll get into at the risk of this not becoming a photography thing is this idea that meritocracy is a left and centrist concept. The American dream is an American culture problem, and endemic to free market capitalism in general. Whoever's holding the banner, that changes depending on whatever the political rhetoric of that moment is. Personally, the thing other than likely Donald Trump having dementia that offends me the most is I can't separate his privilege, his upbringing, his fraudulent life from what he's saying. And I think the whole thing is pandering. I also think, globalization, this is the problem with politics and semantics. Globalization as a capital G word can be used as a weapon because, absolutely, different markets in different continents have a different market price for different services. Yeah. If we really want to go down that rabbit hole and ask the horrible why question, I mean, that's very complex. You could actually ironically blame America for all of that, but we don't have to because it's not important. The thing that is difficult for me to understand is what is the solution to that question. So if we want to, correctly look at Amazon, look at the Chinese labor market, look at India and say they're undercutting, but we do need to source from whatever the arguments are. This is the same way I feel I'm also often branded a communist or a socialist, but, and this is, I think, a human question, which we haven't figured out. What is the right way to do it? Is there a right way to do it? And I think nationalist sentiments, this idea that we close doors and rebuild a personal economy has failed. It just doesn't exist anymore. So how do we embrace the reality and move forward from it? I don't know. It's not working, whatever we're trying.
We shouldn't go down this path, I don't think, but sure. I'm sure that I'm virtually certain that you and I would probably agree on just about everything. I don't know what the right model is, but I think at the heart of it, it's been 40 years or more, 40 years since Reagan and Thatcher. It's been 40 years of an erosion of government revenue, right? And so there's a philosophy which people who have a lot of money have managed to successfully push on the population, which is that it is not good for the government to have revenue, that taxes are bad, right? And the problem is that if you look at the world 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, this is the world that put a person on the moon, and the world that built the interstate system in the US, and the world that built the best infrastructure that the world's ever seen at that time. And tax rates were higher. And so the idea that people in the US have to pay $50,000 a year tuition to go to university. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? And where the Canadian model and the Swedish model and the Norwegian model or the German model are way better, right? Way better for people. And so I think that erosion of of the culture of taxing people has not been good for society. And the other thing is that I don't like the fact that everything is about money, right? This is what it really comes down to. I mean, it comes down to, we've got global warming and we've got these social problems and we've got, systemic racism and we've got all this, but this guy will make things cheaper for me. This guy's better for my bottom line, right? And that's a problem, right? It speaks to people being raised wrong, I think.
It's the snake eating its tail metaphor. And I think I read, or maybe I saw in a TED Talk, but they were talking about how what you're talking, like the characterization of the correct human life has been so negatively affected, actually predating, with the industrialization paradigm, that efficiency should be related to income, or personal fulfillment should be related to how much you can earn or how much output you can produce. But I don't know. I mean, this will be a lead-in. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about creativity, arts, philosophy, politics, just the human experience, opening up from this inflammatory opinion, this rhetoric, because
I want to be really clear on the record. Like, I want Trump gone. I detest the person. I mean, privilege, you name it. Like he's a bizarre character to be the person who's representing himself as looking out for the masses. Like, it's a very, very strange thing.
My Viewfinder is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. If you're looking for more Albertan podcast content, check out their website, albertapodcastnetwork.com. Here's a brief message from one of our two sponsors today. Even now, good advice is within reach. Your financial situation today, tomorrow, or this very hour is why ATB is here. ATB will listen and help with the knowledge and solutions you need right now. Why? Because ATB was built to help Albertans. For more information, visit atb.com. We're always comparative. I think it's part of, I was talking about this with my wife, I think it's part of human nature that we have to differentiate between things. Like, I can't look at, like, there's a piece of paper on my desk. I can't look at that without having a bias about whether this paper is important to me, whether I'm noticing and distracted by the fact that it's orange. It's just how I think we have to categorize things. And, going into arts, creativity, expression, physics, all of this stuff, it is interesting. Like, are we supposed to separate ourselves from it? And how do you make decisions that are constructive for yourself? So you have a career in physics, but now you're leaning into creative endeavors and art. I think they're actually intertwined personally. I studied and failed physics as my first undergrad declared major. So I don't know anything about physics. I've read very introductory bullshit, but I did have that connection. I think you have a curious mind and you want to understand how things work. So
yeah. So I mean, like, I think, first of all, I want to be clear. I failed physics in grade 11 at one of my high schools in Toronto. A lot of times people fail physics because physics is not taught. I mean, if you were in first year, chances are you were being taught by somebody who understood physics. In high school, which sets one up for university physics, in high school, at least when I was a high school student, my impression was the people who were teaching me physics didn't understand it. And physics is hard if you don't understand kind of the essence of it, the simplicity of it, right? And physics, the better you know physics, the simpler it becomes, right? And that's certainly very true. But I would say that I would say that people who are scientists writ large, and I mean engineers and architects areas where people often associate that with what people would have called left brain thinking back in the 80s, right? Which is kind of rational thinking. It's not often that people would associate creativity with those things out there, but I mean, basically anybody who succeeds in science and engineering, really succeeds in science or engineering or architecture or any number of these areas, probably is being creative on a daily basis in their work. And I have found that my mom was an artist, and I always felt that I had no real artistic gifts, no real artistic abilities at all, and that I wasn't really an artistic person. And what I found over the last 6 or 7 years is that I'm actually fascinated by art, and I'm fascinated by the creative process, and I'm fascinated by how similar it feels to sit down and try to create a visual art piece out of, like, to start from deciding I'm going to take a photograph and have that photograph be at the core of a visual art piece, and to work that through to having that visual art piece. That process feels identical to the process of starting with wanting to explore an idea in my field and carrying that through to making some statement that advances knowledge in that field. The two feel very, very similar. I mean, and I read this paper recently by I don't know who it was by, but it was in an academic paper that's in a book called Creativity, and it's just a selection of papers that are dealing with the concept of creativity. And it's in that paper is about the relationship between art and science. And in that paper, they say that there's a number of things that artists, the people we call artists and the people we call scientists, have in common. And one of those things is that people who are artists and people who are scientists, they tend to be what we call polymaths, which are people who are interested in a lot of things. And another thing that they say in this is that a strong interest in science is a predictor of success for an artist. And a strong interest in the arts is a predictor of success for a scientist. The people who are interested in the arts tend to be better scientists than people who aren't. And people who are interested in science tend to be better artists than people who aren't. I found that really interesting.
Doesn't make sense, certainly, for me to boil that down into single concepts, but the word that pops in my mind is curiosity. I think maybe even flexibility. I don't know, for example, celebrity physicists, and I don't really pay attention to celebrity artists either. I kind of get caught up in my own head. But like you said, one thing that I'm pulling out of all of this is this assumption. I mean, it may be affected by romanticism that, when you speak to creative people, if you speak to a great photographer, you can have these conversations like we start off in politics. We don't sit here and talk about, we can talk about the nature of photography itself, and hopefully we will do so. But all of my conversations so far have evolved around everybody's personal passions and interests, which either start through photography or end up in photography, but, just because we're speaking to photographers. But my suspicion is I did this a little bit with my past podcast. When I speak to a painter, they don't read just books about the texture of different types of acrylic paint. Many of them spend all their time on Twitter or on, researching scientific things or watching TED Talks, or, even the idea of a polymath is kind of fun. I've been challenged recently about my own romantic idealisms of what it means to be an artist. This idea of it being intuitive and being something about talent instead of intentional and structured. Particularly in this era. I mean, there may have been a time like when photography is invented and you take your first snapshot. Historically and retrospectively, we will consider that art because there's just something new. I mean, it's science. Photography, more than any other art, I think, is couched in science, at least science as we understand it today. But it is fascinating how modern, like I used to rag on modern art, I still do. Like I don't want to read an essay to understand an image, but it turns out that that is where we're at as a culture. That if like, because the proliferation of Instagram and Twitter and just instantaneous experiences, and they disappear, they lose their value. Maybe what I've gotten wrong, and I kind of I wrote down these notes. When you're doing scientific research, my understanding of it is whatever the base theory and wherever it comes from, that the idea of experimentation and research is not to make yourself correct about it, but to test whether it can be correct and be open-minded enough to understand what results actually represent. And what I've read is a lot of the historical discoveries have come from creative minds who don't get stuck in that rigor where they're so focused on an end product that they're missing what's actually happening in front of them.
Right. So you're in trouble in science, and all of us, there are like everything, there are people who are naturally better and naturally not as good at being scientific, right? Being like doing things like a scientist would do. And I would say I'm the equivalent of in science, I would be the equivalent of a locally known, provincially known artist. So a George Weber, so that people in Europe don't know who these people are, right? They're not talking about their work. They're not wrestling with it. And people in Europe don't know who I am. People in my field, which is space physics, of which there's probably only 1,000 people in the entire planet who are in that area. They know who I am, but they're like my local community. They're like a local community of artists. It's just that it's extended around the world because of the nature of the work. But people who aren't space physicists don't know who I am. Like somebody at U of A who's not a space physicist doesn't have a clue who I am, right? And somebody at U of L who isn't a space physicist doesn't have a clue who I am, right? But I'm very successful. I'm employed. I publish. I've had a few little discoveries to my name, but you go up to the next level, right? Where you get people who are the equivalent of nationally known artists, not internationally known, but nationally known. The people who at the Canada Council are, what's that person up to? And the people, and I don't know of good examples of that, but what's his name? Alex Janviev, would be an example, of that, where somebody who's really well known all across the country. Alex Janvier, I think his name is. And then there's the equivalent of that in science, where there's people who are known, for their work, kind of very broadly, but and then you go to the top level where you have the people who are the equivalent of the Georgia O'Keeffes and the Picassos and stuff like that. And so I'm kind of like 2 tiers down from that, in my view. But one thing that scientists all have in common, is that we have ideas. We tend to like our ideas and would like to see them. And there's a natural human tendency to want to be right? And that tendency moves one away from the objectivity that is fundamentally required in science, right? And so what you said is absolutely correct. I mean, what I have to do when I'm doing my work is I have to remember I'm trying to find out whether or not this idea is correct. I'm not trying to show that it's correct. And those are fundamentally different mindsets. And a good scientist, it's very easy to stay in that. I have an idea. I wonder if it's right, right? As opposed to I have this idea. Now I have to show I'm right. And that's not scientific thinking. And the first one is. And these are and I would say that's the one difference, the one critical difference between what we call art and what we call science. Because what we call science is what I call convergent. And that means that if you're a physicist and I'm a physicist and you have and we're studying the same thing, but you have an idea of what's going on, and I have a different idea of what's going on, that we would agree that there's progress when our ideas converge, that science is convergent. That means that we have this fundamental belief that there's a right answer to this question, and everybody wants to get to that answer. And so no matter where you start, if you're studying something, that eventually you will all end up in the same place. And what we traditionally call art, I would say, is divergent. And by that I mean, you could take and rip a page out of an old coffee table book, right? And then 100 different artists, visual artists, could have that same page, and then take that and transform that into a visual art piece by doing something with that image. And what you're going to end up with is 100 different things. So even if you start from the very same thing, you don't get the same thing, right? And so art, what we call art, tends to diverge and create all these things that are all by definition unique. And science, we're converging on a few truths, and that's. But otherwise, otherwise, my feeling, and the more I get to know about art, my feeling is that the activity of being a scientist and the activity of being an artist is otherwise the same thing.
Well, let's push that a little bit. If we have these two large, philosophical differences, directional differences. So one, so the scientific method, although that has specific definitions, so we'll see if this holds up. But if the scientific method is couched in a belief that there are capital T truths, I mean, now we're getting into ontology, but that there's a capital T truth and a capital E explanation of some said phenomenon. And then we have this idea of art being this proliferation of independent expression and maybe a refutation that there's a single right way, that there is no correct way to paint a sunset. There are a myriad and perhaps an infinite number of experiences. I mean, I don't know if that's actually true, but this is maybe, if those two things are couched in or if those two things are directionally opposed. How do you personally come from science and get interested in arts? So there's what was it for you that broke or interested you in exploring two directionally opposite things?
Well, so again, the interesting thing is art can make sense, right? So if you look at work that people do, a lot of work that a lot of people do on the Anthropocene, right? As you look at Bertinsky, and I find Bertinsky's work makes sense. It feels like I'm looking at a documentary pieces made by a scientist who's a bit dramatic, I think, but a science, like that work. I understand the work, I understand its point, and it makes sense and it's logical. But a key thing about art is that there is no requirement that it makes sense, and particularly contemporary art often doesn't make any sense. And I find it interesting because people will stand up and, like, I haven't seen that many artist talks, but I've probably seen 20, 25 in my life. And I actually did a residency at the Banff Center back in 2018 for a couple of weeks with a group of artists and writers who were exploring concepts around the Anthropocene. And while we were there, I saw a bunch of artist talks just because I was at the Banff Center, and I guess that's what you do in the evening or whatever, right? And one of the things that struck me about this was that the artist often is talking about what they're talking about as though it makes sense, but actually it doesn't make any sense. Right, and I'm not judging the art. I'm not judging the artist. I'm saying that I saw this work by this woman who wanted to explore the Fraser River and to capture that in her art. And what she did was she went every day for a year or whatever, like every day for like a year, and she tied herself with a rope, right, to a wooden pier in the Fraser by Abbotsford, and then went and just sort of floated around in the current for an hour or two. And then she collected mud while she was doing this, and she did things. And then she used that to make these pieces, which, and in all of this, what I heard was she was describing a process. I went out in the river and I did this, and I then took the mud and I put it over this special kind of paper, and then I dried it in the sun, and this is my piece. And so as a process, it made sense. It's like, okay, well, that's a process. But the idea that she was exploring the Fraser River and something about the Fraser River in particular was lost on me, right? And I couldn't translate that to her pieces, which I quite liked, but I couldn't, and I often find that with contemporary art, when the contemporary artist is describing what they're doing. And it's interesting because, I started out not loving contemporary art, and I'm now a person who doesn't like classical older art, with the exception of people like Georgia O'Keeffe. There's a few whose work I really love for a variety of reasons, but generally speaking, I find I don't like the Group of Seven stuff anymore, right? I find it kind of boring and sort of staid and conservative, and like that's just me. But I really love contemporary art. I find it funny and fun and fresh. But then there's stuff that goes too far, right? And I was at the MoMA in San Francisco one time a few years back, and there were these big frame prints, drawings on the wall. And it was graphite on paper, number 1, graphite on paper, number 2, graphite on paper, number 3. And each one was a circle, hand-drawn circle. And I remember I was standing there and I'm looking at it going, and I said out loud, and there was only one other person in the room with me, and I didn't know her. And I said, yeah, I'm not there with this. This doesn't feel like art to me. And the woman who was there, she goes, yeah, I didn't want to say anything, but I'm thinking the same thing. And so sometimes I find myself, I look at something and I think, yeah, no, right? And it's not about the quality of it. It's about, I don't think there's any investment on the part of the artist in that piece. Like it just feels like something somebody, it doesn't feel, yeah. So I love contemporary art, and I find myself in my photography, I got into photography, and the reason why I got into photography was because my marriage was falling apart, right? And it was back in 2014-ish. I was starting to realize that this is not working. This is not, like, I'm certain I was depressed, and I would go for long walks every day, like long walks. And then I got a $1,000 research prize from the University of Calgary, which I could buy something for myself out of this $1,000. And I decided I'd buy a camera. So I bought a camera, and it was like a point and shoot, not really a point and shoot, but it was one of the ones where the lens is built into the camera body. And it was a very good one of those. And I just went around, while I was walking around, I just started taking lots and lots and lots of photos. And I found that the photos were reflecting my mood and how I felt, and they were helping me think about small things, right? So I would go to the same place over and over and over and over again and take photographs of the same things over and over and over and over again. But there were different photographs. And then, if you pan forward, I think I just started to get, I would say, more and more creative, and to kind of head off into this space where I'm taking images and then working a lot with them to make them into something else. And also now starting to get into a little bit of social commentary too. And again, that's said as somebody who's never had a show, and I'm you see my stuff on Instagram. I mean, I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it.
So I'm just trying to get an idea of the mindset. It is an interesting thing going out. So I have a similar experience as far as getting my camera out of a midlife sort of crisis and kind of finding myself stuck pretty deep in a rut. And and yeah, I used my outlet by buying a camera as well. I think it was 2013 or 2014, and just thinking about this sort of scientific process at the level of designing an experiment or a structured approach around some hypothesis versus the first time like a kid pours vinegar onto baking soda. And the first time I picked up my camera, I had a similar experience. I didn't have a thought process around what I wanted it to be. There's no intentionality in a final product. It was intuitive, emotional, sometimes just strictly out of boredom. It's hard to encapsulate it in words, but it was it was an outlet. It was something that I needed to do to get away from, I guess, myself or my situation. Whether that's healthy, we'll invite a psychiatrist to come in next time to talk about the nuances of that. But what I do find, and I think you're talking about the same thing, is if one continues to pursue any practice, in our case, photography, in a curious sense. So it's not good enough anymore to just take snapshots, let's say post them on Instagram or hoard them and then just disappear. We want to do something with them. So for you and I think manipulating images became a particular sort of form. Other people want to either delve into a specific type of photography and create narratives. So whether they're journalistic or commercial or street photography or whatever it is. I mean, there are so many nuances in any field. It becomes interesting to start looking at, don't you have a theory that you're testing out? I mean, there's got to be a driving idea that helps you to continue to pursue manipulate. You gave that talk at Exposure Studio about utilizing scientific data and trying to visualize it. That's vastly different than going on walks and taking 60 pictures of the same flower by the bench. What was it that changed for you, and what drives you to continue to do this, to be involved, let's say in Exposure Studio, or to be involved in this conversation, or to be on Instagram at all, to have that visibility, to get feedback? What's changed? Because there's a structure.
There's a lot in that question, right? And because I've struggled with this. Like one of the things that I've done 2 of those exposure portfolio reviews, and one of the things I struggle with is that this concept of coherent body of work. Okay. And because what I've done is I've kind of used photography to sort of explore how I'm feeling and where I'm at. And that has led to kind of like it's led to incoherence in my body of work. Okay. And it's funny because in science, for instance, like if you look at what I do in my research life, I study what's called the magnetosphere, which is the region of space around the Earth. I take images of the aurora because the aurora are produced by processes in the magnetosphere. And so I've turned the aurora into basically an instrument that I'm using to remote sense the magnetosphere. And I have stayed on theme for more than 20 years and have built a massive coherent body of work and a coherent body of images that now people all over the world are using. And so I think that coherent body of work is absolutely necessary for success. And I don't have it in photography, right? And that's the thing that I'm missing right now, right? And because when I did the portfolio review the first time, people were kind to me, and but and I think people saw something that had some spark or something there. But then I did it the second time, which was last year, and I think people saw a lot more, but there was still like 3 groups of photographs, if you see what I mean. And the one thing I will say is that there was one set of photographs that I brought, and one of my reviewers, he looked at them and he said, "Wow, these are the first images today that I've seen that have made me feel. And there's this thread that I've started, which is taking photographs of people and then taking away almost all of the information from the image, right? So that by processing the image, so that you can kind of see that it's a person, you can see something about it, you can see that it's a nude, you can see there's something you can see about this in this photograph, but it's more and I think that's where I'm trying to work right now in that space, which is to convey a feeling with the photograph. And it's a very, very tough thing for me because I can't it doesn't work, for instance, for me. Like I've tried taking photos of people who I don't know, and it generally doesn't work because I'm not feeling anything, so if I take a photo of somebody I know and somebody who I'm close with, then there's feeling involved in that, and that comes out somehow in the photographic in the piece that results from these photographs, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I'd be happy to show you some of them. I mean, it's just they tend to be better when they're printed, and I've taken to printing them on some strange paper, which also adds to their allure, I think. And they were uniformly, I think, there was about 7 or 8 of those photographs. And then my 5 reviewers from last year, they all loved them. They all were like, "Oh, there's something here. Like, this is cool." And, it's a funny thing because, I don't know, there's an artist in Lethbridge named Mary Kavanagh. And she had a show this past year in the Founders Gallery called Daughters of Uranium. And it's really a fascinating show, and one that I was very interested in because it was kind of around a lot of stuff from Los Alamos, a lot of stuff from the Trinity explosion, the first atomic explosion at Alamogordo. And she had pieces of trinitite, which is this material, which is formed out of sand under an atomic blast. And she had I was actually very fascinated by her show. And she was talking to me about her processes. And she's not doing science. That's not what she's doing. But that being said, she wants a lot of what she does to be reproducible. Meaning, if she tries experiments like with making glass things out of glass that has uranium infused in it. I didn't really understand this, but it's this beautiful green glass, and she makes these beautiful pieces. But then when she was describing her process, what I was imagining was that there's a lot of notes and a lot of record keeping and a lot of, and people who work with ceramics, people who do glazes, they take very, very meticulous notes often about what they're doing, because nothing more frustrating than trying 20 different things. And this is the thing I want, and I don't know how to make it again. Right. And so I think a lot of the tools that we use in science, people naturally use in art, because so you're kind of learning how to do something, and you build on successive trials of that. And it's not all that different than a kid pouring vinegar on baking soda, and a lot of science isn't different than that, right? I mean, what will happen if I do this?
Do you think, I'm struck by the concept of rationalism. So do you think that you can characterize human nature for yourself? Do you think that we are rational at our core or irrational at our core? Because what I hear and what you're talking about is this interesting schism. I think there's a quote, you'll probably know it better than me, but Albert Einstein talks about God. And, there is this projection, a stereotype that scientists, mathematicians, and people that are in pure rational theoretical spaces are these automaton robots devoid of any emotion. And I think that the opposite's true. But when you talk about convergence and divergence, and we talk about art, it makes me suddenly think of a career. I mean, I'm sorry that I'm going to characterize you, but it makes me think of a career in rational pursuit now requiring a balancing in a spiritual pursuit. in something that is going to resonate, something personal for you, an emotional release. But I don't know if that's.
I mean, I'll be really clear about this. There's like I've read a lot about the scientists who did the work that, because physics changed in the early part of the 1900s. It changed a lot. And what happened was the scientists in the latter half of the 19th century were showing that there were limits to the understanding of the world and the way the world worked, that a lot of the basic physics that people had presumed was correct wasn't correct, that there were fundamental problems with what happens when objects move fast, or what happens when objects are very small, what happens, like, there were fundamental limits that we weren't, that the physics just didn't have right. And Einstein came along at the right time. He was a brilliant person, and this large group of people actually who rewrote the laws of physics from 1900 to probably the 1940s. And a lot of those people are some of the most interesting people I've ever read about. And they are, find Richard Feynman, for instance, or Albert Einstein himself, or Lise Meitner, or Werner Heisenberg and Erwin Schrödinger, and all of these people. And they were brilliant, they were creative, they were philosophical, deeply philosophical. They were, if you look at Feynman, not Feynman, but if you look at Oppenheimer, I mean, I think at his core, he was trying to make war impossible, right? And so these were people who had lofty goals and vision and creativity. And I would not say that, I would not describe science as a rational pursuit. And I honestly, I think if you're not in love with science, if you're not in love with physics, don't be a physicist, right? It's actually I can imagine many jobs where you can be good at that job, where you just think that job should be done, and that job serves your life very well because it makes you a good living, but that loving it is irrelevant, But physics ain't it. I mean, if you want to be a physicist, because it's hard, it's a hard vocation, and you have to learn a lot in order to be able to contribute. And one of the things is, like, I'm teaching a third year course right now, and I'm delving into the material and deeply, and it strikes me every day. It strikes me how much I love this stuff. Like, I love the way it fits together. I love the way that you can come at things from a mathematical point of view, or from a stating some obvious physical facts point of view, and kind of get the same thing. And you can use math to inform the physics and physics to inform the math. And there's this giant playground to move around in to kind of do stuff that's interesting. And I found that what I have found is that maybe the best way to say it is that my photography, or my trying to do my photography, has shown me how science is not rational, right? That the only difference between trying to do something in art and trying to do something in science is that in science it has to make sense and it has to be objective. But otherwise they're very, very, very similar. And so I mean, and the thing is that it's funny because rationalism is scary to me. I genuinely believe that if people made decisions in the world, if people were well balanced and grounded, and they made decisions based on feelings, that the world would be way better off than making decisions based on rationale. Somehow rationalism, let me backtrack a little bit and say that I one time heard this guy interviewed on the Oprah network, interviewed by Oprah when I was traveling in the US one time. And he was the person who had developed, he and another person had developed and were teaching a course called The Science of Happiness. And it's either at Yale or Harvard, I'm not sure which, but it doesn't matter. It's Yarvard, it's at, one of those two. And they said they started this course because they were interested in the concept. They were two psychologists, whatever they were. And they started this based on the idea that they feel our society has it wrong, that our whole society is set up so that you become successful and then you will be happy. So go to university, get an ability to make a living, get a house, get a car, get an income, and then start building up wealth, and then you'll be happy and you'll start working on happiness. And they said that they felt, and that they had scientific evidence to support this, that this was, in terms of if the objective is to be happy, that this was not a good approach. And that they felt that people should work on being happy, and that paradoxically, so that the one thing they said, the one thing that like success correlates with a lot of things, but what it doesn't correlate with is happiness. So the idea that successful people are happier than less successful people is apparently scientifically demonstrably garbage. However, people who become happy, people who are happy and happy from their youth, actually tend to be more successful. And so that they felt that we turned it around, and that we put the cart before the horse and put success before happiness. Whereas not only if you work on happiness first, you achieve the objective of being happy, but you also are actually likely to be more successful than you would have been otherwise. And so they started teaching this course, and it's now the most popular course at whichever university it's at. And they said it's really surprised them, because they said they have a very jaded student population, people who are going to Harvard to become lawyers, or going to Harvard to become doctors, or going to Harvard. It's all about marks and getting there fast and making the most money. And that population is also really hungry for this message about happiness. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I think if people were happy and people were making decisions based on emotion, then we wouldn't have global warming as a problem. We wouldn't have war. We would have that we would, because, if I'm happy and I value being happy, and I'm making decisions as a CEO, which are polluting the lakes and driving up the temperature of the earth, if I respond to my feeling about that is it's disgusting and it disgusts me. And I'm disgusting myself by adding to that. Whereas I can rationalize that I'm the CEO and I have a fiduciary duty to make money for my shareholders, and that's my responsibility here. And objectively, I have to put my feelings aside and do this, and you're right in both cases, but the outcome is better in the case I described, right? The outcome itself. And so I don't think rationalism is, I think people tend to be rational or emotional. I'm very feeling driven in all my decisions. I don't, I drive a lot of my colleagues crazy because I don't sit down and make a matrix and, figure and put points in and everything else. I just say, this feels better. I'm going to do this. Yeah, that's a long answer to your question.
All right, let's talk about polymaths. By definition, a polymath is a person of a wide-ranging knowledge or learning. It's a bit abstract. It's interesting to think about defining people by only one aspect of their life. This assumption that a photographer, for example, only cares about their camera and the quality of their exposure is, frankly, kind of insulting. What drives art and creativity is dimension and depth. And how can we lay claim to either if we aren't interested in everything around us? So I have to ask you, what books and interests do you have that are not photography related? Have you read something recently on science or sociology or, bookbinding? Do you craft? Do you dance? Play baccarat? I don't know. This week, my challenge for you is to take a peek at something besides your camera that you're passionate about, and then let me know how this does or may in the future influence your creativity. Here's another message from one of our 2 sponsors today. Today I want to talk to you about another podcast in our Alberta Podcast Network family. It's called Anti-Culture. This is a podcast that seeks to challenge and reestablish our view on what culture and identity really mean. The true culture of an individual and their lives is only found when we take the time to hear what they have experienced from their own point of view. Coming from a mixed background and having experienced different cultures worldwide, Josiah started this show to reestablish the concept of culture that we have developed by even subconsciously labeling those around us before we hear their full stories. You can find Josiah's podcast Anti-Culture at albertapodcastnetwork.com, on any podcast streaming platform around you, or you could check out his website, josiahpodcast.com. That's JOSIAH podcast.com.